welcome back. All right, so these 32 team videos, it's basically turned into kind of a challenge at this point. Like, hey, can I find a player in each team which, in this case, it's a player who has benefited from moving to the team they're currently on. A player whose play got better or who just, got more ice time, just in general really likes where they are comparatively speaking with where they were. And the way I've organized this is from the newest team in the league to basically the original 6. And everything's in reverse alphabetical. And of course you've got the first expansion, another, and then you got the WHA expansion, which is unusual because 3 of the 4 teams have moved since the WHA expansion. And then you get into the 90s and beyond as well. So just if anybody's wondering how I put this one together, yeah, I thought, well, I'll have a pattern, but it'll be something I've never used before. So starting off with Seattle, player that I think benefited quite a bit from going to the Seattle Kraken last year. And there were a few. There were absolutely a few, but I'm going with Jared McCann. Jared McCann setting some career highs this past season, and it might just be the beginning. There is a good chance Seattle's scoring numbers go up. Maybe McCann's numbers go up along with them. Maybe they stay the same, and maybe it's guys like Wright, Beniers that come in and get those extra points and those goals to bring the totals up. But I went with Jared McCann for Seattle. Sure, why not? Vegas Golden Knights, I went with an oldie but a goodie here. Because really, in all honesty, I think the career that benefited the most from the expansion in Vegas is William Carlson. I don't know that William Carlson, if he'd stayed in Columbus, ever would have had the opportunity to really prove himself the way he had in Vegas that first year, right? All the goals he scored. And he's been a very consistent two-way threat since then. The goal scoring may never be what it was that first year, but I think Carlson absolutely benefited from going to Vegas. There were many who did. So you guys can let me know in the comment section below which player you think benefited the most from a move to either of these 2 brand new teams. At least one's brand new and one's kind of brand new. Kind of losing that new car smell there, Vegas. But Minnesota, I went with Ryan Hartman. Ryan Hartman was starting to look like a guy who's going to bounce around the league a bit. Then he gets to Minnesota, and honestly, this past season, absolutely fantastic year. I don't know that he would have replicated that anywhere else, but it dwarfed anything he had done in his career before this past season. So I think Hartman's a guy who's absolutely benefited from being part of the Minnesota Wild. And again, I don't know that there's a way to get this wrong, so you guys can let me know in the comment section below who you think. Because again, this isn't really a right or wrong thing, much like when I talked about good contracts. I don't think there's a right or wrong there. But because it's opinion. Columbus, I went with something different, and I'll explain why. So it's not just about the goal scoring totals. Patrick Laine being in Columbus, it feels like it's taken out the uncertainty. When he was in Winnipeg, there was a lot of uncertainty about how happy he was, how happy he wasn't, problems with teammates, problem with coach. Where's the problem? What's going on? And then he'd go into these long droughts from a goal scoring perspective, and there was all the analysis of who he should play with and who he shouldn't. And it feels like in Columbus, that's kind of gone. Part of that may be he's not playing in a market now where he's going to get scrutinized quite so heavily, but I think Laine has absolutely benefited from going to Columbus. Now he's signed that extension there as well. So yeah, a lot of that uncertainty when he was in Winnipeg is gone. So while the goal scoring, the points have stayed pretty much the same as they were in Winnipeg for the most part, I really think it's benefited him going to Columbus, which brings us to Winnipeg. Winnipeg, I think Neil Pionk needed to get out of New York, get away from the Rangers, and I think it's been a really good fit with the Winnipeg Jets. Pionk's a player that I've liked since he was with the Rangers, actually. He did have a really rough season there, but I still supported him through that. I will support, especially young defensemen. I find those really rough seasons get kind of overblown a little bit by people like, well, he's just no good. He's young. Defenseman, it takes a little bit longer. So Pionk figuring it out, and I think his last couple of seasons in Winnipeg have been quite good. I didn't think this year was as good as the year before, but I'll still have him on the board. For Nashville was tough. I got to be honest. Nashville was tough. So I went with Jeremy Lauzon, and here's why. To me, Duchesne had a really good year, but is Duchesne better in Nashville than he was elsewhere? I don't really think so. Johansson had a bit of a bounce-back year, but I don't think his totals are better than what they were in Columbus. I'm going with Lauzon for a reason that's a little different than some of the others, because in Seattle, he just kind of looked lost, and towards the end of his time there in Boston, it was clear they didn't have any plans for him. It's obvious to me that Nashville wants Lauzon. They're going to hold on to him for a while here. It looks like he's finally found a home in that bottom two pairing for the Nashville Predators. Good on him, and all the best to him. And so that's why I picked Lauzon. People will skip to the end and say, Lauzon, why would he pick him? And that's when you say, he must have skipped to the end. Florida, I'm going with a pickup on the waiver wire. So Gustav Forsling in Florida, I think, has been more effective than he would have been anywhere else before getting to Florida. Originally, of course, a Canucks prospect, and then he moved to, I think it was Chicago and then Carolina. Florida's just really good at picking up these players and turning their careers around, and I think Forsling's the most dramatic example of a defenseman that was waived. They pick him up, and now he's a bona fide top four defenseman, and he's kind of good in every area. There's no chance Florida waives him. So, yeah, I'm going to say that's a win for Forsling and a win for the Panthers. The Anaheim Ducks. The Ducks are tough because they're going through a rebuild. It is tougher for the teams going through a rebuild to find a player that you say, well, he's better off there than elsewhere. Looking at you, Montreal. But we won't get to Montreal yet. So for Anaheim, I went with a player who has left Anaheim twice and keeps going back. And I think the more that he's away from Anaheim, probably the more that he appreciates the Ducks, and that's Derek Grant. Derek Grant, a player that I really think is playing his best hockey as a member of the Ducks, and anytime he leaves Anaheim, it doesn't work out. And then he ends up back with the Ducks. So we'll see if that's still the case. We'll see if Grant ends up being trade fodder at some point this year, and if he ends up back with the Ducks a fourth time. But, yeah, for me, Derek Grant's the one with the Ducks. And, again, a lot of young players in Anaheim's lineup. Kind of hard to pick out guys that you go, well, they've really benefited from going to Anaheim. Stolarz would be a pick as well, I guess. Sure, why not? Tampa Bay. Picked a goaltender for Tampa Bay. So, coming out of Brian Elliott's last season in Philadelphia before going to Tampa, it really looked like he was winding it down, like his career was almost done. I think that him being the backup to Vasilevsky added some time to his career. He's 37 years of age. So, even by goaltending standards, 37, you're getting up there. And so I think Elliott playing in Tampa, the amount of rest he's going to get, and the fact he's playing behind a sensational defense, it could add years to his overall career. So yeah, Elliott to me is the guy for Tampa. Tampa also a team that's done a really good job of developing from within. So not a team that you can look at a lot of transplants and say, well, they're better off in Tampa than they were elsewhere. They're pretty good at drafting and developing players. Ottawa. There's a lot of new players in Ottawa, but a lot of them haven't played yet. So I'm going, to me this one was pretty obvious as well, and it's a goaltender, and it's Anton Forsberg. Forsberg bounced around the league plenty, waiver wire, and I felt bad for him. Got to the point where I think he just stopped. Either he stopped getting new pads, or he was being waived so often he didn't really have time to get them. But yeah, Forsberg's found a home in Ottawa. He has finally got a home. He's finally got a one-way contract. He's making good money. And it's a good story. And it's an example of why goaltenders, holding on a little bit longer and waiting for your opportunity might be a good idea for goaltenders. We see a couple this year that could end up being in that category too. You've got John Gillies. You've also got Charlie Lindgren. Two examples of goaltenders who've been bouncing around the league that may very well have regular jobs in the National Hockey League this year, and maybe follow in the footsteps of a guy like Anton Forsberg. San Jose wasn't that easy either. So for San Jose, I went with Alexander Barabanov. Barabanov with a good season for San Jose. Of course, originally in the Toronto organization. I don't know that Barabanov, if he'd stayed in the Toronto organization, would have got further ahead. I mean, it's possible. But with Toronto, their depth is a little bit underrated at the forward position. And I'm not sure that Barabanov would have been able to achieve the point totals he did for San Jose this past season. So he is the one I went for with San Jose. Erik Karlsson hasn't been as good in San Jose as he was, say, in Ottawa. So I couldn't use Carlson as an example. And I felt like, well, Reimer, and again, it's just you look at these totals, you look at points. And again, I was doing this with a lot of players today. And I went with Barabanov for San Jose. So we're out of the 90s expansions. We're into the WHA expansion with the Oilers. The Oilers won. Not a lot of thinking required for this one. Evander Kane. So I mentioned, Evander Kane is a guy, that if he can keep his nose clean, absolutely great pickup for Edmonton. I'm also going to use him here because as much as he's been a huge find for Edmonton, Edmonton's been great for him as well. It's been mutually beneficial. Coming out of that disastrous finish to his career in San Jose, there was rightfully questions being asked about what his place would be, where he would fit in. He's fitting in very well for the Oilers. They found a way to keep him. That was a key thing coming into the summer. It didn't look like they'd be able to keep him. They did. And it's possible Kane scores 50 this year. I think it would be a disappointment if he doesn't score at least 40 this season. And it gives them something on the wing during the regular season for a full year that they really haven't had with McDavid. They really haven't had that sniper who is a pure winger. Draisaitl at points, of course, paired with him. Having Kane there means you shouldn't have to have Draisaitl on the same line as McDavid. Draisaitl should anchor his own line. And then ideally, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins anchors the third line, and you have a ridiculous amount of depth down the middle if you're the Oilers. For Colorado, Valeri Nichushkin. Nichushkin had to get out of Dallas. Dallas had to get out of that relationship too. It just was not working. He goes to Colorado, and it has been seamless. It has been fantastic. It again has shown that Joe Sakic is a wizard when it comes to putting together a team. Absolutely fantastic run for Nichushkin, and we'll see how things go for him and for the Colorado Avalanche going forward. But, he signed a long-term extension there. He's sticking around, and it's the kind of money he would not have made if he'd stayed in Dallas. I really don't think if he'd stayed in Dallas, if he'd come over and tried to make nice, and Dallas had held on him, I don't think he achieves the heights that he has in Colorado. So, no hard feelings from me as a Dallas fan either. I'm glad to see that he's turned it around. Clearly, it wasn't a great setup in Dallas. It's a great setup in Colorado. All the best to him. Carolina. There were a couple I considered for Carolina, but you know what? Coming out of the season that Freddy Anderson had in Toronto and all the uncertainty about him, and now he was replaced by Jack Campbell. Seeing him go to Carolina and settle in and just play really, really well. He did get injured again, and injuries are always a concern with Anderson from one year to the next. But honestly, Anderson had a great year. I talked about him in the goalie video the other day. The goal saved above expected. Fantastic. So yeah, Freddy Anderson's been a success story for Carolina, a team that does pretty good at bringing in goaltenders from other organizations and turns them around. So Anderson's another example of this. Not that his numbers were bad in Toronto, but he has looked better in Carolina than what he did in Toronto, especially that last year. So, good job there. For Arizona, Travis Boyd had an absolutely ridiculous season for Arizona last year. Comparatively speaking, anyways, with previous years for other teams, I was surprised. I did not think Travis Boyd had that level of offense in his game. He scored at a good rate, and now he's got an extension with Arizona. I don't blame him either. Arizona's not an organization you think of in terms of, players taking, he signed an extension for the Coyotes. That seems kind of weird, and yet with Boyd, you totally understand. He's bounced around the league for a while. Now he's got a home in Arizona, and he's basically got himself guaranteed ice time. I would say top 9. I've seen projections of him on the first line. I've seen projections of him on the second, third, even fourth, but I think he ends up on at least the third line. I don't think he necessarily gets 35 points again, but it was a remarkable year. Washington, former Canuck here as well, because Travis Boyd played briefly with the Canucks. Nick Dowd was briefly with the Canucks too. Nick Dowd has become a fantastic fourth liner for the Washington Capitals. Absolutely sensational. His game miles above whatever it was in Vancouver. Or it's an example of Vancouver making changes too quickly in certain areas or not seeing the potential in a player, but it just works in Washington for Dowd. I think it's his best run he's had in his career. And yeah, I mean, he's a very reliable fourth line forward. You need those. You need those if you're going to be a contender. New Jersey. Well, this one's going to be fun to write up. Can I just write Jonas? You guys are going to know if I say Jonas, right? Possible Jonas Siegenthaler could have had this upward trajectory on the Capitals' blue line. but it feels like he's better in New Jersey than he was in Washington. Whether that's perceived or it's reality, you guys can decide. But yeah, Siegenthaler has been a revelation for New Jersey as a defensive defenseman. Siegenthaler is right up there with Slavin in terms of, hey, we should have a defensive defenseman award. And I do hope at some point in time, while I'm still drawing breath on this planet, that the NHL realizes, hey, we've got a Norris Trophy that usually goes to the offensive defenseman, the guy who scores a bunch of points. We should have one for a defensive defenseman, and Siegenthaler might get some votes in that direction. He's been excellent. For the New York Islanders, going back to another goaltender. So, I remember it was eyebrow-raising when the New York Islanders decided, Robin Lehner's been a great story. We don't need Robin Lehner. And they went out and got Semyon Varlamov, who was coming off of a bit of a down year. It was a bit of a surprise. And yet, it's worked out really well for Varlamov and for the Islanders. And again, as I said with Carolina, the Islanders, the goaltending coach, that excellent work. You see it with the Islanders. You see it with Sorokin, too, right? These guys, any goaltender they've put in there over the last half-decade has looked really good. And Varlamov is no exception. And at the time he signed that contract, it was seen as one that had a lot of risk to it. I don't really hear anybody talk about, oh, it's a bad contract now. And it's because Varlamov has picked up his game since he arrived with the Islanders. Calgary. Player I've talked about a couple of times lately, Elias Lindholm. In Carolina, would Lindholm have reached the level he's at in Calgary? I don't think so. I think that Lindholm, the real test for him could be this year, because there's still going to be people who say, well, look, he was playing with guys like Tkachuk and with Gaudreau, so clearly that's going to drag his point totals up. In the event that we see Lindholm's totals take a bit of a drop this year, if he dropped into like 65, 60 point range, it would give credence to people who say, well, he's more of a production or more of a result of his line mates than anything else. In the event that he stays at the 80-plus point mark, it'll back up people like myself who've been impressed with Lindholm for a long time. He was a guy I picked as a breakthrough candidate when he was in Carolina. It didn't happen, but eventually it has now in Calgary. And so I'm hoping he maintains that level of production, but I do think he's benefited to playing with the Flames. For Vancouver, you know, this is part of what inspired me to do this video today, JT Miller. So on the Canucks forum, they've resurrected the thread on JT Miller, the trade to Vancouver, and how much Canuck fans just hated it out of the gate. Just hated it. How horrible a trade it was. I remember at the time talking about I liked the trade, and I saw some risk to it, but I didn't mind the trade. And being told, well, clearly you're crazy because this trade is ridiculously bad. And it's worked out pretty well. JT Miller's been pretty good. For somebody who was time and time again, people said, well, he's just a 50-point forward. He's a 50-point forward. Why? It's not a big, it's a 50-point. We gave up a first-round draft pick for a 50-point forward. Now he's coming off of a 99-point season, almost double that 50-point forward. So even if Miller drops back a bit this year, it's been a really good setup. I understand why he decided to stay in Vancouver. It's been good for his, not just his bank account, it's been good for his points totals. And I think it's pretty clear he's having fun in Vancouver. Does he have an attitude? Well, yeah, but it doesn't mean he's not having fun. I have attitude half the time I'm having fun, so whatever. Yeah, I'm having fun. Buffalo. So last year, they didn't have a goalie for a while there. They had Luukkonen signed, but they didn't have a veteran signed at all. And then all of a sudden, they signed Dell, they signed Anderson, and they're, you know, then all of a sudden they have goaltenders. But I don't think any of us expected Craig Anderson to play as much this past season as he did, and relatively well too. I think Craig Anderson, by being in the Buffalo organization, is getting an opportunity to play he wouldn't have got for most of the other organizations. Craig Anderson in his early 40s, I think most teams figured, well, he's done at the NHL level. And he may be after this year, but Buffalo's added years to that career. So I went with Craig Anderson. There were others I thought of like Tuck, but Tuck's numbers aren't necessarily better than they were in Vegas. It's just, I think we're surprised they haven't dropped in Buffalo. But yeah, I went with Anderson. For St. Louis, an addition from last year, Pavel Buchnevich. Buchnevich, of course, coming over from the Rangers. He played well for the Rangers, but not as well as he did for St. Louis this year. It just worked. This is that chemistry thing I always talk about. Some players go to a new team and it just works. There are other players go to a new team and you realize, wow, this is a bad idea. This is a bad idea for everybody involved. Where's the GM going? Why isn't he watching the rest of the game? But Buchnevich has just fit with the St. Louis attack. And within, I would say, the first 2 months of the season, once you're at like the end of November, you wouldn't even know. You'd be like, well, how long has Buchnevich been there? What do you mean he's new? He's just absolutely played really, really well right out of the gate. And I think that's been a great trade for St. Louis. Understandable why the Rangers made the deal as they did. But, yeah, St. Louis definitely did well with Buchnevich there. Pittsburgh. There were a few choices I could have gone with Pittsburgh. Now, I'm going to go with this choice for a different reason than some think. Now, Jeff Carter was not playing badly with the LA Kings. I'd even go as far as to say I don't know that Jeff Carter played much better with Pittsburgh than he was with LA. And I'm not trying to disparage the way he played in Pittsburgh. I think he was playing well in LA before the trade. It's just nobody was paying much attention to LA before he's traded to Pittsburgh. So I think with Carter being in Pittsburgh, I think it's extended his career. So talking about Craig Anderson down here, talking about Brian Elliott for Tampa, Jeff Carter playing in Pittsburgh, I think has extended his career. I don't know if he would have stayed, kept playing for the Kings, but it just works with Pittsburgh, and he slots in as that number 3 center. You've got Crosby, you've got Malkin, you've got Carter. If this was 10 years ago, we'd be talking about the elite level that they have down the middle. But even 10 years later, we can say, hey, Carter's still a capable point-producing center, and there's a lot of experience there. So in the event that one of the top 2 centers gets hurt, and with Crosby and Malkin, that's highly likely, Carter can jump in. And he's already shown that with Pittsburgh too. So I think it's helped to prolong that career. Philadelphia. Philadelphia was tough, and honestly, this one I might regret. So Cam Atkinson had a tough relationship with John Tortorella, was the rumor, right? And so for Cam Atkinson, being in Philadelphia last year, it feels like his points totals came back to where you would expect them to be, and he's probably happy to be there rather than Columbus. Now Tortorella is the coach of the Flyers. So Atkinson, I might have wanted to put an asterisk on this. I'm not going to, because I'm gonna be an optimist in this one that Atkinson's totals stay up. But if the relationship between he and Tortorella deteriorates, it'd be interesting to see what happens there. So I'm going with Atkinson, and full disclosure, it is tough to find a player right now in Philadelphia that you can say, man, they're playing so much better in Philadelphia than they did elsewhere. I almost put Kevin Hayes up because Hayes, at the time that his contract came to an end, playing in Winnipeg, he did not look good in Winnipeg. It was a rough end for him, but I thought he's probably happy he's not with the Jets and playing the way he did with the Jets, but he was playing pretty well with the Rangers before that trade. He had totals with the Rangers that were similar to what he's had in Philly, so I went with Atkinson as having a big bounce back year. All right, LA. For the LA Kings, Philippe Danault. Again, you want to talk about a player that very surprisingly starts scoring goals up there with Nichushkin is Danault. There was no indication in Montreal that he had this elite offense in his game at all. But maybe it's just a matter of them not having line mates they could give him like LA did. It just worked. So for Danault, we'll see if that carries over into this year. But yeah, career highs and all that. I think LA's pretty happy with that contract right now. And again, part of what's on this board is that these are players that I think if they had stayed where they've been beforehand, probably wouldn't have been as good as they are right now. And I don't think Danault would have scored nearly as many goals for Montreal as he did for LA this past year. Because it just, Montreal, overall a rough year for them. Dallas. For Dallas, I went in a bit of a different direction with this. And I'm going to say this straight out. I think Joe Pavelski's playing the best hockey he's played in his career. I really do. I think Joe Pavelski right now is the best player that he's been in his entire career. Now, whether or not that rolls over into this season too, can he keep that up? It gets difficult as you get further into your 30s. But I've learned not to bet against him. Pavelski had a slow start this past year too. And yet by the end of the year, that's completely forgotten. So if he gets off to a slow start this year, and if I make the mistake of saying he's off to a slow start, you guys, the subscribers, you need to make sure that you refer back to this video. You can even timestamp it as 24:44 here. Yeah, don't say Pavelski's off to a slow start this season. Hockey guy, don't be a fool. He fooled you last. Don't be a fool. He's going to get it together if he has a slow start. Pavelski, again, I think playing the best hockey of his career. Now we get into the original 6. Starting with Toronto again, reverse alphabetical. So last summer, when Toronto signed Bunting, I loved the signing. I was so amazed with how well Bunting played in Arizona the year before. But I had no idea how many points Bunting was going to score. I didn't know Bunting was going to end up in the conversation for the Calder. That's certainly not something I saw coming. Bunting, absolutely great chemistry out of the gate with his line mates in Toronto. As long as we don't see a situation where there's a more talented winger, potentially named Robertson, that might come up and steal some ice time from him. Just using that as an example. If Bunting can keep that prime ice time, I don't see any reason the points totals won't stay where they are. The one thing with Bunting being older, well, you see is what you get. So he's very unlikely to develop that next gear and get into the 80, 90 point range or anything. But still, he's a solid producer, and good on him for getting into at least the consideration for the Calder. And Toronto got themselves a steal out of Arizona. For the New York Rangers, I went with, and you know what? I tried to talk myself out of this one. I did. Here was my thinking. You know what? Artemi Panarin was good in Chicago. He was good in Columbus. So then I looked at the totals, and I thought, you know what? He was good in Columbus. He was good in Chicago. He's just been playing better for the New York Rangers. So while Mika Zibanejad gets an honorable mention here, I'm going with Artemi Panarin. I think Panarin's developed into a better all-around player with the Rangers. I think that he can hit 100 points. I think he can hit 105. We'll see if 110 is possible, and maybe 100 of those are assists, right? Panarin is an excellent passer, really solid player, and it looks like he's having a great time for the New York Rangers. That's where he wanted to play. That's what he told Columbus. And honestly, it has worked out really well for him and for the Rangers. A team that suddenly finds themselves a Stanley Cup contender, and Panarin is definitely part of the reason for that. That guy in net, though, it's pretty good. So that's part of the reason for the Rangers. With Montreal, a tough team to find a player. Got to be honest, most of the veteran players are gone. A lot of the veterans that are there, I can't say they've played their best hockey for Montreal, so I had to get a little creative. With Montreal, Rem Pitlick. So we're less than 4 weeks away from me doing reviews for games, and I don't recommend a drinking game out of me complimenting Rem Pitlick on how he plays for the Habs. I think he's played really, really well. And considering, too, how he goes from Nashville to Minnesota to Montreal, no problem. He just goes out there and tries to prove that the teams that have given up on him were wrong. And so Pitlick, on a deal that's very team-friendly as well, likely to go out there, I'd say 45 points, possible. 20 goals, that is possible as well. We'll see what happens with Pitlick. But he is one of those rare, right now, players who've been transplanted to Montreal and have done better. I would love to put Suzuki up here, because it puts Suzuki on the board a lot, but never played in Vegas. So, Rem Pitlick, Montreal right there. For Detroit, this one I had to consider a bit. I looked through some players. I'm going with Jacob Verana. Now, Jacob Verana's tough because he hasn't had a full season. He has not had a full, healthy season in Detroit yet. But with the goals he was producing last season, prior to the injury, and just in general, he projected out his goal-scoring rate in Detroit has been very high. We'll see if it continues over a full season if he gets that this year, but I think Verana has played very well for Detroit. Bit of an honorable mention to Nedeljkovic, but Nedeljkovic's play dropped off in the second half, as most Red Wing players did. So, for Chicago, another team that it was kind of hard to find a player, I'm not going with Seth Jones, because I don't think Seth Jones' play got a lot better, but I will say that Caleb Jones finally got an opportunity, and I think he took care of it. I think he grabbed that brass ring, so to speak, and I think he did well. I think he did well on a Chicago team where not very many players did well. So I'll go ahead and throw Caleb Jones up there. A player who had been in the Oilers organization, a team looking for defense. So I was mildly surprised when Caleb Jones ends up in Chicago, because the Oilers had, at the time, clearly been looking for more depth on defense, and I think Jones is good, but he's been better in Chicago, I would say. So, ending off with Boston. Boston was tough. There are a lot of transplants, but I can't argue Taylor Hall's playing better in Boston. I can't argue Hampus Lindholm's playing better in Boston. He's barely played. And then you got Ullmark. I thought, well, Ullmark maybe. Nope. Ullmark's stats are the same in Boston as they were in Buffalo. It's just now we're paying more attention. So with Boston, I had to kind of just bite the bullet a little bit on this because it's a tough one. I'm going with Charlie Coyle. Now, Charlie Coyle, who has had some issues as playing a role that I think might be a little more prominent than he might be most comfortable with. But, yeah, his totals, comparatively speaking with Minnesota, I think have been better. And it is the one that I look at on this board and I say, that might be more of a reach. But again, with Boston, there's a lot of homegrown talent. There's also a lot of players who are transplants from elsewhere, but I wouldn't say their game necessarily got better. I looked at Craig Smith. Craig Smith's numbers still in line with what he had before he got to Boston. Again, Taylor Hall, he didn't have that offensive output that you might have wanted. And so it's tough to find somebody in Boston who's a transplant from elsewhere that has played better in Boston than they did elsewhere. So I'm going with Charlie Coyle, but you guys can let me know in the comment section below who you would have picked for each team, because again, it's not about being right and wrong. It's about just a fun 32-team video and players that I think have benefited from being traded. And maybe I'll do a video on players that have benefited from not being traded, the best homegrown talent of each team. So look forward to that. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. If you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.